Welcome to my review of Steel Helmet by Charles Packman, a 1959 pulp war novel published by Digit Books, who seem to have been very busy publishing pulp novels or out of copyright texts in a pulpy style. Just about everything about the book looks and feels cheap. Even the cover is oddly reminiscent of Mills and Boon. I half expected it to be about a French girl finding some sort of comfort in the helmet, steel or otherwise, of a German soldier. That is, if the back cover didn't literally spoil the entire story, including the ending. So we should probably get into that story, and you can slide the timer to the point indicated on your screen if you'd rather not hear about the plot, but no part of this review should be considered spoiler-free. The story takes place shortly after D-Day, with Canadian soldiers Cridell and Bailey travelling with some other prisoners of war on a German train. As the train crosses a bridge, they jump, and the story flashes back a few days. Cridell and Bailey's unit were landed in Normandy, but after the initial offensive had already secured the beaches. But their initial peace doesn't last very long, and after a firefight on the outskirts of a French town, they're cut off from the unit and pinned down by a German machine gun while heavily outnumbered, and they're forced to surrender. While being transferred from outpost to outpost and bombed by their own side, a recurring event by the sounds of it, they hear about secret weapons that Hitler is developing to win him the war, even with the Allies and Russians making gains on both fronts by this point. Eventually the story catches up with the prologue, and after their escape, the two make contact with the French underground led by the unofficial captain Maquis. Maquis is impassioned to remove the Germans from France to the point of a reckless mania. He tells the two Canadians he will eventually reconnect them with the Allied forces, but in the meantime they're behind enemy lines and will have to join his unit on a string of raids, each increasingly fraught with danger than its predecessor. A raid on a French noble and suspected collaborator's chateau goes awry, and the group makes off with Lucille, the noble's daughter that Maquis suspects of being a traitor. The enamoured Cridell is protective of her, but they're soon on the run again, with Cridell then meeting up with a rival partisan group. This second group is trapped in an area in which the German presence has been increased considerably after Maquis' raids, but they plan a raid on a German ammunition store. Naturally, that doesn't go to plan either, and they're spotted after one of their number tries to destroy what he believes to be Hitler's secret weapon. The group scatters, leaving Cridell alone again. After learning Lucille, who he had believed dead, was being held by the Germans in a nearby mansion, he stages a one-man rescue bid, which is interrupted by another Allied bombing run. The destruction that causes helps him rescue not just Lucille, but a handful of American servicemen being held in the building. As they trek across France in search of Allied forces, they are instead reunited with Maquis, who still intends to execute Lucille as a traitor, and Cridell still objects. With their uneasy alliance just about holding, Maquis ropes Cridell and company into a raid on a nearby secret weapons location, revealed to be a V2 battery, which again goes wrong when they trip a secret alarm. They do succeed in putting the rockets out of commission and disabling the German protective gun emplacements, but with Lucille missing and Cridell deeply suspicious of Maquis, the story ends, switching to a wider view of an Allied major leading the offensive in the same area, and ignoring as best as he can messages to try and find the French fighters who have led that very raid. His men do find the French nobleman unharmed, but discover that the truck Maquis and Cridell were in has been destroyed with no survivors. The major finds Cridell's dog tags, doesn't care very much, and returns his attention to his own command. And yes, the publishers spoiled the deaths of Lucille and Cridell, the lead character, remember, on the back cover, because they are massive pricks. The plot, as you can probably tell, though not related in the first person, follows Cridell almost exclusively until the final chapter. As such, it is quite episodic, but it isn't really as big a flaw as that sometimes suggests. Cridell is bounced from encounter to encounter, and overdeveloped self-preservation instinct usually puts him hot on his heels when the odds count against him. Packman, though, rarely lets a moment breathe or linger, and Steel Helmet is characterised almost entirely by a breakneck pace, one action scene following the next as doggedly as Cridell's German pursuers. And if the raids do get a bit far-fetched, especially Cridell's attempt to rescue Lucille on his own, there is a real energy and verve to the text that make it hard not to just roll with it, perhaps even to thoroughly enjoy it despite your better judgment. The story makes frequent mentions of Hitler's secret weapon without ever really building up the idea that there is an urgency to discover what they are and foil those evil plans. Part of it is that relentless pace, part of it is that Cridell has no real agency as he's moved from skirmish to skirmish, and part of it is that Packman never gives the reader the idea that Cridell has much of a grasp on what is actually going on. The action usually takes the form of a surprise attack out of the night, gloomy French mist, or smoke-covered buildings. Action is frequently related, as seen in the flashes of bombs or lit by fires, obfuscating friend and foe alike. It is, for 2/3 of the book, very effective and a lot of fun. The verisimilitude, the air of authenticity, is punctured a touch by the one-man rescue bit, and though the return of Maquis is very welcome, the attack on the V2 base is surprisingly low-key and low-paced. Perhaps Packman just ran out of steam. The failure to resolve the intrigue around Lucille as traitor or not, executed or not, is desperately disappointing. As editor or publisher, I would have thought long and hard not to include the epilogue. Without it, the final moment would probably never have become as iconic as the unresolved end to the Italian Job, for example, but it would have been better without the callous reaction to the death of a character we followed through a dozen encounters with the enemy, and it still, despite that, leaves the fate of Lucille hanging. A more cynical man than myself might suggest that with Cridell's story here ending at page 142, a publisher with a formula to follow might have suggested something along the lines of, get it up to 150 pages or we won't put it out, which is why the ending is tacked on, and for want of a better word, crap. Cridell as a character deserves better, though mostly because he's been through quite a lot and not because he's particularly well developed. His affection for Lucille and his antagonism for Maquis, neither really goes anywhere. He's nothing, though, if not pragmatic, relating the demise of certain French partisans as heroic, while he himself runs from the scene, as familiar an occurrence as the Allied friendly fire, but never really going into full cowardice. He is, after all, the brave one, he tells us so himself, and Bailey is perpetually afraid, and his disappearance from the text is a shame. Some of the characters don't really hang around long enough for Cridell to learn their name, or perhaps even for Packman to give them one, but they still leave an impression, the big Frenchman particularly, imparting enough wisdom to keep his men alive, long enough for them and him to get killed in the next skirmish rather than the current one. It's that sort of book. It would have been really nice to see Lucille do more than just flit in and out, especially after Cridell goes to so much trouble to rescue her, though Maquis, with his Napoleon delusions, is as dangerous to friend and foe. That he doesn't get more developed is a bit of a shame. The antagonism between the two men could have made this something really spectacular, especially if any of it was actually resolved. Packman, despite having the outline of some really good characters, has gone hard and completely in for all-out breathtaking pace. It's difficult to say if another 100 pages fleshing out those characters might actually have been a bonus, because when the befuddling mists clear long enough for Cridell to actually have a handle on where he is or what he's doing, the book is actually poorer for it. Which is not to say that Packman can't write. I'm half convinced he's actually some sort of genius, because if you can read the first 100 pages of this book and not be wrapped up in the adventure, you're a better man than I. This is despite the fact that he's absolutely obsessed with onomatopoeia. Not the sort that makes you obviously a genius, perhaps the sort that just shows you're a madman. The repetition is obvious and it carries on throughout. But as you can see from the page numbers, after overusing crump for a bit, Packman realises that it's got a bit much and he switches to wham instead. Here's a question for the military-minded out there. When does a machine gun not go at? When they go burr, 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 obviously, and check out the page numbers again, they fit so neatly together. He must realise what he's doing and then change his mind, but he never goes back to mix it up. It's very strange and it's completely unnecessary. While onomatopoeia can put your reader in the middle of the action if you do it right, it doesn't really make any difference here if you were to take it out. They sat and listened. Sweat started to form on some faces. One man started to swear to himself, softly with a kind of passion. Wham, wham, wham. The 3 concussions seemed to lift them off the floor of the boxcar and slam them down again. Dust rose, blinding them, and, for a frantic moment, Cridell thought the engine had been hit. And Packman's text is so intense at times, this, at the start, is basically what would pass for a quiet moment. Here's another one from the first page, and it sets the tone rather nicely. Some nice, perhaps unidiomatic adjectives adding to the tension. I really like the immediacy, the threat implied by using in and not by here. The pulse is created by this repetition. This is pretty well done, but the onomatopoeia seems cartoony. Packman's style then feels less effective because of it, not more. And it becomes more like the Commando comics that were popular in the same era, but they existed. They catered for that market, and while no doubt there would be some crossover in audience, Packman surely is aiming for a slightly different demographic. You'll have noticed in both extracts as well the idea of the obfuscation that I mentioned earlier. In amongst all those cartoony sound effects are passages that just feel like the work of a genuine craftsman, such as describing the V2 rocket as the futuristic dream of some mad artist. Perhaps not the only one involved in this book, because there are just some words where you really don't expect them, but often they're more effective for it. If the example before is unidiomatic, what can you make of the tank tracks tearing the earth to confusion, or the sky being lit with malice? With something of a penchant for gore, this is not a text that's pulling too many punches. It feels rather like a great artist tasked with painting a nursery and then unable to restrain his craft, producing a mural out of some sort of Lovecraftian nightmare. My favourite part of the book, that threatens any and all pretence of credibility, is when a Frenchman asks Cridell, "I must admit, our arrangements are sometimes not running to, what do you call it, schedule?" Like the French don't have a word for schedule. In conclusion, Steel Helmet might be the pulpiest of war pulps. It might even be bordering on brilliant. The story begins in medias res and barely pauses for a breath across 100 pages of clumping and whamming onomatopoeia, much of it adding little to tight and effective prose that has a lot to recommend it, succeeding in being both exciting and enjoyable. Characters come and go rapidly, the body count is high, and recounted in a way that's grisly enough for the text to feel right at home on the shelves opposite the likes of Kessler and Hassel. The ridiculous pace that Packman sets inevitably runs out of steam towards the end, and it's a shame that the text shortchanges Maroc, its most two-dimensional character, before he even earns that third dimension. This is a very fine war book, with an aggravating ending that offers no respect and no real resolution to anything that goes before it. I still recommend it unreservedly to anyone who can get their hands on a copy. So if you like this video, feel free to like and subscribe. If you ring the bell, I will see you in the next one. Bye.